Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe here with me, my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
Today we've got Sturm to discuss. And, well, it's time for a Sturm talking to. I love that pun. What do you think, Dan?
Sure.
Alright. So, Sturm Brightblade is a pretty interesting character. He is an exiled baron of sorts. And I say of sorts because he's supposed to be the heir to Brightblade Keep, but his father was slain by a mob that was set upon him by pretty much the Crown Guards. Bony-faced Crown Guard, who ended up just wanting the castle and the Brightblade possessions, which he got a lot of. And when I say possessions, I mean the lands. So you had Sturm's dad, who went to hand himself over to the mob and perished at their hands, while Sturm fled with his mother. And Sturm was but a child and couldn't really fully remember his dad years later. But this incident haunted him, as his mother told him stories of how great his dad was. And reading up about his dad, Angriff Brightblade, he was great. He was a very different person from Sturm, though. He was cheerful and friendly and loved jokes and laughter, was fairly open-minded. I don't think he had a problem with mages too much. He just seemed like a great guy and fun to be around. Sturm, on the other hand, is grim, melancholic, and generally not always a funny guy to be around. He's not fun. He's very clinically depressed. And I'd be surprised if Sturm made it to 50 years old had he survived the story, if I'm being honest.
He's good to watch. He's someone you'd want to watch your back. But to bring him over to have a couple drinks?
No. He's not much good for that. That said, Sturm was always someone who he longed for battle as much as he longed for the chance to restore his family's good name. And his mother did encourage his dislike of Raceland. And she herself had her own flaws. She never tried to fit in with the rest of Solus. So that it's funny, but she had a lot in common with Raceland in that regard. Solus did not much like her. Which, that's on Solus to an extent, but it's also on her. She was a haughty, dignified noblewoman who hated having had to lose her territory and whatnot. And the saddest part about how she brought up her son is that he ended up more like her. And so he didn't make many friends. And he ultimately became as somber and melancholic and depressed and lonely as she was. Which, in that regard, she failed her son. But on the other hand, she instilled in her son a love of Huma, honor, history, learning, and the knighthood. So she did succeed as a mother in other ways.
She just had a rough path, and for someone to lose, like her, to lose the legacy of her son,
and even her own,
it's very painful.
Yeah, I do feel bad for her in that regard. She obviously struggled. What I also find is the saddest scene involving her is when in Soulforge, Raceland did everything he could to help her. She ended up dying, and she worried most about her son. And then you have a scene where Sturm just breaks down crying. And it's one of the only two scenes like that for Sturm. The only times he ever wept for anything was his mother and the knighthood. But somehow when he weeps for the knighthood, it's far more sad, because this is his every belief system. His everything he loves in the world, as far as he's concerned, is dead. And he has nothing left to live for or to fight for. He's just, at this point, just doing what he can because he loves Gunther like a son loves a father. And he's got nothing else left. After that, he's liable to just throw himself against a dragon and die, which he basically did. But that's enough about him in Winter Night. But the thing is, Sturm is a massively tragic character. He's someone that I'm firmly of the opinion, yes, he acted as a diversion for the dragons, but he could have survived it. He didn't want to. He is noble in a way that, much as I love Caramon Magir, Caramon struggles to be noble. I really love Caramon because he struggles with virtue, and he does rise to the occasion eventually. And he often does rise to the occasion, but he struggles with morality, where Sturm, it comes a lot more easily in some ways. Honor is something that Sturm never Sturm is like, oh, I struggled to be honorable. No, it fits like a glove for him. Bravery. My gosh, Sturm is brave as heck. As a swordsman, he is the equal of Caramon Magir. Like, the thing is, Sturm Brightblade is everything a knight should be, and is a true knight archetype character. He's also, in a lot of ways, a better friend than, say, Tanis is at times, and he's also far more analytical and intelligent. He could probably lead the team if he wasn't so depressed. And I know a lot of people might say it might not be the only factor. No, it is the only factor. It's his depression and his melancholy that keeps him from leading. If he was a king, he'd be Louis XIII from French history, who was a morbidly depressed king with fits of rage, but also incredible IQ. He was one of the best kings in French history. His son, the Sun King, was terrible compared to Louis XIII. Louis XIII pretty much single-handedly won the 30 Years' War when he finally did join it. Like, he crushed all the rebellious factions and barons within his realm like that. And not even his father succeeded at that. Him and Richelieu reorganized France in such a way that, France was stable, and the problem is it was an absolute monarchy, and under Louis XIII it could work because he was abstemious, frugal, he was, he cared about his subjects. And he's like, well, I want them to have middle-class lives. I don't want to just grind them under my heel. Whereas his son and descendant, Louis XIV and Louis XV, and even Louis XVI, just saw it as party. So under a hard-working monarch, the system worked, but under a lazy monarch, it really didn't. And it became tyrannical. Sturm is like Louis XIII. He's a workaholic. He's depressed. He's just such a tragic character. But the sad thing is, while he learned to open his mind to the world, he never learned to open his heart. And experience and suffering taught him not to. And when you look at how he's treated by a lot of people, you can understand. What I love is how the elves sometimes are pretty tsundere here, and how you have them. They run hot and cold, but you have Laurana and Alhana sometimes running cold, and you have Sturm, even colder than them. And then you have Alhana, hurt and annoyed because he's colder than her and she's not sure if he actually cares. The thing about Sturm is, if you're a jerk to him, he can be even more of a jerk to you. And you know what? You'll feel it. The only character I think who weirdly can out-jerk him as in a mean way is Raistlin. But that's where I have to admit, much as I'm a Sturm fanboy, Sturm started it. Raistlin did not start that feud. It was Sturm Brightblade. But primarily, I think it's Illis Brightblade, his mother, who started it. So, sadly, the son got to inherit that little problem. But by the time of Dragons of Autumn Twilight, you have Sturm, who traveled for a short time with Kitiara Uf-Matar before they separated and went their separate ways. Kitiara made her way to Naraka, where she was to agree to serve Ariakas in many a ways. Sturm, meanwhile, made his way to Salamnia, claimed his heritage, which was basically a sword and a breastplate, and nothing else, and then proceeded to, I think, serve Gunther for a bit before making his way back to tender his services to the companions. And when you read Dragons of Autumn Twilight, you see that Sturm's weird. He, on the one hand, does continue to keep chasing Raistlin out, and he does not acknowledge Raistlin's carrying the whole team and being the whole team, because Raistlin is the team. Without him, the companions would have died against Draconians at the lake. Heck, they'd probably end up dying in the inn. They wouldn't make it very far. I know that's a weird opinion to have, but it's just Raistlin is the team. But on the other hand, Sturm is a weird mixture of competence and suspicion. Now, all the companions are very competent individuals. The problem is the challenges that they meet with are at times too great for them. And it's Raistlin who has to constantly carry them through the danger, much as Gandalf often did early in the quest for the 9 Walkers in Fellowship of the Ring. But Sturm is someone who does not like Raistlin and doesn't trust him and doesn't want to cooperate with him. But when push comes to shove, Sturm is an incredibly capable individual. He's able to use slyness and cunning to do what needs to be done. He's able to strategize, to slip out of a bad situation. He's a weird kind of knight. He's got that kind of honor that I've seen a lot of fantasy fans in recent years scorn and hate. You know, the one where I can't run away. But on the other, which ironically, that chivalry and Bushido do state you can run away. It's just a matter that you have to do so tactfully and with a stratagem in mind. But Sturm has that kind of, I can't run away honor, but on the other hand, he's able to make it work. And he has the brains to fight the good fight and whatnot. So it's really, really incredible to see him work a kind of magic in a way of competence, capability, and stratagem a lot of the time. That said, sometimes his prejudices get the better of him. Well, sometimes. You look at how he suspects Raistlin all the time, or when he suspects Gilthanas favoring Eben at one point. Though later he does admit, yeah, it was totally Eben. Well, that's no surprise. So on some level, he knew it was Eben. It's just he didn't want to believe it because he didn't like Gilthanas. Because it was 3 humans against the elves. That said, Sturm serves as the anti-Raistlin on the team at times. Just, sure, he's capable, but he just hates Raistlin. Which, their relationship is a fascinating one. I kind of wish that in Winter Night they ended up on the same team during the split, because it would have been interesting.
Indeed.
To have the two of them have to put up with each other. And maybe have Caramon and Raistlin maybe separated as well. So this way...
I wonder how Sturm would have responded to the sudden betrayal.
That's in Spring Dawning, you mean?
Yes.
Well, we won't get too far ahead. That's like, I want to get to that when we get to that. I'm not sure, but just I also want to put that answer off because I think that's its own video.
That's fair.
I don't have an immediate answer for how he would have reacted to what Tanis did. That said, Sturm was ever the most stern member of the team. So, in short, while Riverwind and Goldmoon will immediately forgive Tanis, I don't know if Sturm would have. Sturm is many things, but forgiving is not one of them. I don't think he'd forget what was done that day. Or for 3 nights. 3 days and nights, I should say. And weirdly, it might have been the only incident where he sided with Raceland. But like I said, that'll be its own video because that's a good question. That aside, and that'll be when we get to Spring Dawning, which hopefully is not too far off. My hope is we can have in like next week or the week after the next Winter Night video and just have the, I guess, just have that properly edited, thrown at people, and then we'll hopefully have, as soon as possible, the next Winter Night video because, yeah, and there's a reason why we're doing it in 50-page blocks so that we get through this as quickly as possible into Spring Dawning because I really want to finish the Chronicles. But that said, Sturm's role in Autumn Twilight is one where he keeps trying to be a gentleman to Goldman as well, and he clashes a few times with Riverwind over that, who I think is jealous and kind of insecure about Sturm. But Sturm's just a gentleman. Now, I do have to comment on one thing that is connected to Autumn Twilight, and it is the fact that it was retconned in with the second generation novels that Kitsuhara was able to seduce Sturm with general ease, suggesting that Sturm is undisciplined and dishonorable. And that is what it means. He's not an honorable fellow. He's disloyal by his very nature, unfaithful, and cowardly in a lot of ways because he didn't have the guts to admit to such a deed and did not push hard enough for marriage or claim his son when he should have. And that generally he's a hypocrite. I don't approve of it, and I'm even going to suggest an alternative reading. Steel, Brightblade, is not actually a Brightblade. He's not Sturm's son. And Kitsuhara did not actually seduce Sturm. That's how I prefer it, because I just don't like the idea of Kitsuhara seducing Sturm, because Sturm is so sanctimonious. He would not... He wouldn't be seduced. And I honestly think that Steel, for one thing, is also a boring character. I'm just being honest. I don't know. I've never met anyone who liked the character. And what's more is that I don't like the idea of turning Sturm, subverting him into a hypocrite. Because why not have him be honorable in everything that he was built up to be, and have Kitsuhara be as vile as she was built up to be? These are their archetypal roles. And my view is it's so much more interesting that while on the journey, she was seeing other guys, and maybe one of her, well, she was, and one of her many lovers maybe knocked her up. And she just simply said, he's Sturm's kid, out of spite, because Sturm refused her. And I would say that's a good explanation for why Sturm, if he knew about the kid, wouldn't have claimed him. And Sturm, I guess I just view it as, he's perceptive. I think he'd know that she got knocked up. And I think he'd know not to trust Kit, especially when it comes to his bed. And I think if anything, in some ways, the Brightblade legacy should end with Sturm. Now, a part of me does think it'd be very interesting for him to indeed have a child, but on the other hand, there's a tragedy to the Brightblade line being so wonderful and so honorable that it dies for honor. And it casts a great shadow over Solamnia, which is haunted by the loss of its greatest lineage. or second greatest, because I just remembered there's also Huma's line. But I just think that there's a tragedy there, and there should be a tragedy to Sturm. But if he did have a kid, I don't think it'd be with Kitiara. The thing about Sturm is he's ever so honorable. Unless you'd rather read him as a total hypocrite.
I'd rather not see him as a total hypocrite. He is too rigid, too inflexible.
And I like him that way.
He's loyal to Tannis, knowing Tannis is attracted to her. So he's not going to chase her or let himself be seduced.
Yeah, but the idea is that, every knight has a chink in his armor. Not Sturm. Sturm does not have a chink. It's only when he finally cracked in front of Lord Gunther that he showed there was a human being in there. And that's the thing. He does not have chinks in his armor. He started softening up towards Raceland, reluctantly, and that took, how many years? About 25 to 26 years? Dear Lord, that rivalry, to an extent. It's like he's known Raceland since Raceland was pretty much a child. Since almost he was born. And it's taken him like 26 years to finally soften. I'm sorry, but that man has no soft spots. He might have the same impulses as another man, but the thing is, we should never forget that there are men that disciplined and staunch. In a lot of ways, Sturm, I would argue, has also a lot in common with maybe Charles de Gaulle from French history, who remained possibly a virgin till he was 30 years old, married his wife, and was rigidly faithful. And like you read about Charles de Gaulle, he was rigid, strict, and severe, and honorable. And there's also Louis XIII, like I said, who was much the same as Sturm. And the difference is Charles genuinely loved his wife, so, he had quite a few kids. Louis did not like his wife. Well, when you look at how she raised Louis XIII, not 14, I mean, you can't blame him, because her idea of manhood was very different from his. Her idea of a man was a self-indulgent fool, while his was very peculiar, and he would not easily let himself be seduced at times, and that was with his wife. Sturm in some ways strikes me like that. So yeah, I do have a beef with the second generation in that regard, and that's something that I kind of prefer. I guess Sturm being every bit as severe and strict and cold as he portrays himself as and presents himself as. And turning that on its head, I don't much like. I find that boring, because that's basically every other story. And you look at knightly characters who aren't, like, you know what I mean? Whom it's turned on its head in some fashion. That's been done in almost every story. You kind of had Boromir, but Boromir had to rise to the occasion. I count him. I'd argue you have Gwydion. I mean, he basically fell for that kind of enchantment by Krynn instantly, like that. So I kind of consider him like that. He's not there. He's got a massive, he can be tricked or seduced.
Yeah, he resisted Okryn's advances,
but he still got enchanted and captured, because her enchantments just enhanced the attraction you feel to her, and he did fall for it. So I'm actually going to argue with you on that one.
Fair point.
You have, let's see, every knight in Game of Thrones, every knightly character in, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. You have every knightly character in probably Sword and Sorcery. You have, every knightly or chivalric or honorable character since, well, almost forever in fantasy fiction. So my point is Sturm is an unusual case. He is actually, you've got two ways to look at him. You go with the steel brightblade as his son idea. He's a hypocrite. And I'm going to be honest, I find him completely unlikable. And I have contempt for that interpretation of Sturm. And I actually think Die Worm die because it's just, he looks down on Raceland, looks down on Caramon for
philandering,
and yet he did that with Kitsiara. You look at the fact that Kitsiara ended up, well, having a kid with him. And the thing about Kit is I find her lies very obvious. And you look at the story, every character found her an obvious liar because she's too prolific with her lies. So, Sturm, it's just every inch of his character falls apart with the steel brightblade thing. But if you discount that and you read it more as it was Kitsiara being Kitsiara, and Steel might not be his son because how many guys was she seeing? I'm just saying she is that character. And taking the more likely thing that Sturm was so sanctimonious and whatnot, I would argue I really can't see him doing the deed with her. Like, I kind of see it as I like Sturm the other way, more cold, rigid, and inflexible. It's just so much more interesting to have a knight be honorable, but also that honor did twist him into a cold jerk in some ways. It's why I love him as a character. He like, you look at Huma. Huma's warm and friendly and kind and gentle. But you look at Sturm as a character in personality, he's in a lot of ways kind of like Olivia Armstrong from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, or even kind of like in some ways Hiei from Yu Yu Hakusho, or to an extent I guess you could say he's also got a side to him that's probably a bit like Cull from Howard's stories. Melancholic, insecure, but also cold, distant, stern. Like, I just think that's much more interesting. So, yeah, tell us what you think is more interesting to your mind. And I know people may say, well, face the facts, this is the canon. I would argue there's the narration and there's also the fact that the way the stories are often told leaves a lot of stuff open. And I know a lot of people, we've been scolded and told, no, there's only one absolute way to read any story. But you got to bear in mind, Wace, for example, does not read fantasy. She reads Dickens. And Dickens and Austen and a lot of those Victorian authors, there's always room for interpretation. You're not supposed to just read the words and believe everything the narrator tells you. You have to question everything the narrator tells you. So, in that regard, I'm just arguing, let's bear in mind where the angle from which Wace, for example, is coming at the stories with. She's coming at it with a very English major mindset, rather like Girl Next Gondor. So we have to read the story that way, I think, and kind of question everything and analyze everything. But it's a lot funner, I think, to read a text and question it and ponder it and digest it and go and reread it and come back to it with a different angle every time, because it means you do have to reread it multiple times, and that can be fun. And anyways, that's just me. So tell us what you think, and do you love Sturm? I can't wait to talk about. Yeah, we did discuss a little bit of Winter Night about him, but I can't wait to talk about him in regards to Winter Night and kind of the possibilities of Spring Dawning, what might have been, I guess. So don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Sky trying to get at Sturm and tearing apart the High Claris Tower.